We'll get going. So, welcome. It is February 18th, and this week is the Haftarah of the Parsha called Terumah. I hope that some of you in our community saw the already saw the Hebrew vocabulary. Um, if you did not, I will post it when I post the link to this, and I will try to translate everything as I go along. Okay. So we're going to do this as we have been. We're going to go through a summary of Truma. I think last year when we were doing Parsha, I was in America for this Parsha and we did not do it. Um, but we're going to do a summary of that, a summary of the Haftarah, the parallels, as always, universal wisdom. We'll see where we'll see how long my voice lasts. Okay, so here's the summary. First of all, the Parsha of Truma is in the book of Shemot, in the book of Exodus, chapter 25, verse 1 to chapter 27, verse 19. I apologize for those of you that don't live in America because I don't know if you have these kind of stores, but my husband refers to this as a Home Depot Parsha. Home Depot is like a place where you buy tools and building equipment and stuff in America, uh, because there are a lot of details in this week's Parsha about the construction of the Mishkan. The Mishkan was the portable sanctuary that was used in the desert before the Israelites came to settle in the land of Israel. The name of the parsha, Truma, it literally means offerings, and it's found in the first verse of this parsha, Exodus chapter 25, verse 2. So basically, the people of Israel are called upon to contribute materials to the building of the Mishkan. It's 13 specific materials: gold, silver, copper, three colors of dyed wool, blue, purple, and red, flax, goat hair, animal skins, wood, olive oil, spices, and gemstones, out of which God says to Moses, this is in Exodus chapter 25, verse 8, they shall make for me a sanctuary and I shall dwell amidst them. We're going to talk a lot today about this concept of what that means, God dwelling amidst the nation. But when Moshe was on Mount Sinai, he's given detailed instructions on how to construct this dwelling for God, not just to construct it, but remember that the nation is moving around all the time. And so it has to be able to be dismantled, transported, reassembled as they move through the desert from location to location. In the inner chamber of this sanctuary, of this tabernacle, of this Mishkan, there is this woven curtain, very beautiful. And in there is an ark that contains the luchot, the tablets of testimony, where the Ten Commandments were engraved the second time. On the ark's cover, there were two winged cruvim. I think you call them cherubim. Cher, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. But these two winged with the human faces, very, very important in Torah thinking. It is, I assume, the model for like, if you go to like a store today and you buy like wrapping paper or some decoration with angels, it's like these, human faces with wings. I believe that it comes from the biblical image of the cherubim. I'm not allowed to say it in English, of the cruvim, and they were made out of pure gold. And out of that, outside of the inner sanctuary, was a seven-branch menorah and the table on which this very special bread called the showbread was arranged. Interestingly enough, there's somebody in Israel, a baker in Israel, who, if you ever come, I can hook you up with him because he teaches all about this very special bread and he actually has workshops where you can make it. Anyway, the sanctuaries had three walls and they were fitted together with wooden boards. It actually sounds to me a little bit like a sukkah, except that each of them had a layer of gold on top of that, and it was held up by some kind of silver sockets. I don't understand all that. And there was three layers on the roof. There were tapestries that were made out of this wool of many colors and linen. and then a covering of goat hair, and then another covering of animal skin from a ram and from the tachash. I will talk about that in a little bit. And then across from the front of the sanctuary was an embroidered screen that had 5 posts. You see that it sounds like blueprints, or it sounds like architectural. Um, there's more architectural details in this parsha, but you get the idea, okay? That the parsha is heavy on how many of this you need and how big they have to be and which materials and how you put them together and all that stuff. Okay. So what does that have to do with, that's the parsha of Terumah. What does that have to do with the Haftarah? So the Haftarah comes from um, the Malachim Aleph, First Kings, chapter 5, verse 26 to chapter 6, verse 13. And what happens in that part of the book of Kings is the details of the construction of the first temple. So you see right away, there's a very tight connection. So this week's Haftarah describes the construction of the Holy Temple under the direction of King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, which obviously echoes the Torah portion that talks about the construction of the Mishkan, which was the tabernacle in the desert. Okay, so the Haftarah talks about the manpower, both Jewish and non-Jewish. We're going to talk about that. That King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, recruited for building the Holy Temple. Um, there's also a discussion of how the stones that were used in the temple were hewn and how they were transported, the laying the foundation, the dimensions of the Holy Temple, its components, its materials. So there's also a lot of Home Depot kind of stuff in this. But it ends with some beautiful words that God says to Shlomo Melech, King Solomon. And this we find in chapter 6, verses 12 and 13. These are the two verses. This house which you are building, if you walk in my statutes and execute my ordinances and keep all my commandments to walk in them, then I will establish my word with you, which I spoke to David your father, and I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. Okay, so there's the construction details, and there's a promise from God that if Solomon, King Solomon, and his nation keeps the Torah according to the way that um, his father, King David, understood them, then God will be among them. Okay, now what does it mean for Hashem to dwell among the children of Israel? So this expression, it refers to sort of a prophetic experience of God by the entire nation. In a few places in Tanakh, in Hebrew scripture, there's something that's called in Hebrew kavod Hashem, the glory of God being with the people. The first time is at the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. The second time is at the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary in the desert. And later, the Holy Temple provided this physical location that replicates the closeness to God that the nation felt at Har Sinai. Now, obviously, this is hundreds and hundreds of years after the Sinai experience. So nobody who was alive in it to experience the revelation of Torah at Har Sinai and to feel God's divine holiness and closeness was still alive in the time of Shlomo Melech, in the time of King Solomon. But the the idea that God can be a presence in your life that's so palpable, that idea was kind of passed down from generation to generation. But the building is not enough. Without Jews keeping, or well, let's call them Israelites, without the Israelite nation at that stage, keeping the covenant, keeping the Torah, even this beautiful temple is really just stone and wood. And the idea is that God is dwelling among the people, not in some grandiose building. In other cultures, in other idol worshiping cultures, there's an idea that if you build a temple for your God, that the God will dwell in it. Here, the dwelling is conditional on the nation keeping God's word, keeping the Torah. Okay. Let's look at, I made a chart to parallel between the Torah portion and the Haftarah. So there's a theme, and then I'll tell you how that theme expresses itself in the Torah portion and in the Haftarah. So one theme is the type of the structure. Okay. So in Parshat Truma, it's a portable sanctuary in the wilderness. It gets broken down, transported, and rebuilt every time the nation is assigned to move to a new location. In the Haftarah, the temple is also a sanctuary, but it is permanent. It's a permanent temple in Jerusalem. And of course, excuse me, the very same site where the first temple is built, that's where the second temple is built, and where we um, believe and hope and pray that we will see soon the third temple in that same site, which is so interesting what's going on right now. So politically, that area is referred to as the Temple Mount. I think Arabs call it something else. But I read something very recently that for many years, I was up there one time. It's very hard for a Jew, for an Israeli Jew, to go up there. It used to be very hard. You had to go through, there were like two lines. One line was for the Jews of Israel, and the other line was for everybody else. And the other line was like this turnstile at a Disney ride or something. Like if you just get in that line and they let you in groups at a time. For us, and we were maybe 12, 15 people in our group, they took our passports, they took our they told us we couldn't bring anything onto the Temple Mount with us. I'm going back now probably 12 years. And they made us wait a really long time. And I don't know what they were doing, checking and seeing if we were agitators or whatever. Meanwhile, we see dozens and hundreds of other people going through this turnstile onto the Temple Mount. And when a Jew goes onto the Temple Mount, because it's a place of such extreme, extreme, extreme holiness, there are rules about where you can walk and where you can't walk. So we had a tour guide who was well versed in that, and we obviously did eventually get on. Um, but it's an incredible, incredible experience. But now, let's say 12 years later, maybe longer than that, I'm not really sure. This many years later, many, many, many more Jews are going up, and it is much easier to get up, and much more is permitted. When we went, we were not allowed to bring a bottle of water because Jews make blessings before they drink or eat anything. And so they didn't want us making blessings. You weren't allowed to pray and so forth. And now you can see, I don't know if any of you have seen these pictures, but there are pictures of groups of men that are literally prostrating themselves on the grounds of the Temple Mount. So a lot has changed, and that indicates to me that we're getting closer and closer. That was a very a very long digression. Okay, who initiated the building of these various structures? So the Mishkan was initiated through a command that God made to Moshe, and the temple was built by Shlomo Melech. The whole temple, by the way, was designed by his father, King David. And many, many of the materials that were not all, but many of the materials that were going to be necessary to build the temple were acquired in the lifetime of King David. But he did not merit to have the temple built in his name or in his lifetime, and so it was built by his son. How were these things funded? So I already told you in the Parsha of Truma, if you look in the book of Exodus, chapter 25, verse 2, it's all voluntary donations according to whose heart moves him. Like anybody who wants to can, here's the things we need, the 13 kinds of materials we need. If you have that and you want to donate it, you're welcome to. The funding model for the temple, I already told you that King David prepared in his later years a treasury. There were some other contributions, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But a lot of it was sort of it was saved for over time. The main materials in the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary, was gold, silver, copper, acacia wood, and fabric. And the temple was cedar wood that came from Lebanon. I have a lot more to say about that. Stones that were quarried and gold. Okay. And in both cases, the most important part was this this aron, this ark. that had the kruvim, the cherubim. I really should have looked up how to pronounce that. That was made of beaten gold. That was in the Mishkan. That was like the heart of the Mishkan, the most sacred part. In the temple, that part is called the Holy of Holies, and it also had kruvim, but they were made with olive wood. It wasn't the exact same ones. They were made with olive wood and they were overlaid with gold. Um, and what was the intention? So in the Mishkan, in the portable sanctuary, God didn't tell them right away, I'm giving you the Torah, now go out and influence the nations. Instead, he commanded them to build this Mishkan. This is in Shemot, in Exodus chapter 25, verse 8. Make for me a sanctuary and I will dwell among them. So it's a more kind of internal thing. Um, the idea of after the nation experienced the greatest revelation in history, it would be understandable if the next thing that they were supposed to do was now go talk to the rest of the world about me and tell them what the Torah says, but that is not what happened. Same thing is true in the time of the temple. Is in if you look in Melachim Aleph, First Kings chapter 6, verse 13. Again, God promises, I will dwell among the children of Israel. So there's an intention here somehow that God wants to be close to this nation, and he wants a physical structure in both cases, some kind of a physical structure where he can concentrate his presence. This concentrated presence of God in these physical structures is sometimes referred to as the Shekhinah. Um, which is a very difficult concept to explain. I think we've spoken about this a little bit before. It is this constant presence, this divine presence in the wilderness. It was unconditional. Okay. Um, in the presence of the Shekhinah of the divine in the temple was conditional. What was the condition? It was dependent on Israel's obedience to God's laws. If you walk in my statutes, that's the verse I read, chapter 6, verse 12. And just again, the setting is that the Mishkan was in the wilderness. It was a transition period for the nation. These are the people who had been slaves in Egypt, who were freed, who were wandering in the desert for 40 years, by and large, not so much the men, but the women and the younger people. And the Mishkan had a different flavor. The setting of the temple, there's now an established monarchy in the land of Israel. Okay. Um, Now there are some, so that's the sort of parallels of the structure. I want to go deeper and talk about the parallels thematically, because the Mishkan represents holiness that you can move with you, and the temple represents holiness that's rooted in place. Okay. So God's presence traveled with the people. Interestingly enough, this is also true of exile. So the Shekhinah, the divine immanent presence of God, it is said that when when the nation is sent into exile, and we are currently in the fourth exile, um, that the Shekhinah accompanies the nation in order to protect it. And I learned this from Rabbi Pinchas Winston. He says that when anti-Semitism is on the rise, it's a sure sign that the Shekhinah has withdrawn and that exile is over. So that's one of the argument is not, that's one of the points that I make when I talk to Jews who are living outside of the land of Israel, and who are experiencing such um, unbelievable anti-Semitism that's just getting worse and worse, is that it's a clue. It's a spiritual clue that the exile's over and it's time to come home. That's an aside. Okay, so both texts, both the Parsha and the Haftarah, describe craftsmanship, precious materials, measurements that are very precise and have deep spiritual significance, some of which I don't understand. The kruvim, these cherubim guarding this innermost space. But in both texts, the key message is, even though most of the verbiage is like architectural details, the key point is not about the architecture. It's about God dwelling with the nation. So in Terumah, I will dwell among them. in the Haftarah in First Kings, if you walk in my statutes, I will dwell among the nations. So the structure is just a vessel to contain the holiness of God's relationship with the nation of Israel. At the center of both the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary in the desert, and the temple in Jerusalem is the Ark and the Kruvim, the Holy of Holies. This is the innermost space that most represents the closest possible relationship between God and a person or God and a nation. The buildings have sacredness, but the building itself is not what creates holiness. Holiness is created in the relationship between a nation and their creator. Okay. Um, let's talk about what can we draw from this living as we do in the time between the second and the third temple. So first of all, the first temple was built during a time of stability and diplomacy. It says in the beginning of this Haftarah that in chapter 5, I'm in First Kings, Malachim Aleph, chapter 5, verse 26, the Lord gave Shlomo, that's Solomon, wisdom, and there was peace between Hiram and Shlomo. Who is Hiram? We're going to talk about him a lot more. He is the king of Tyre in southern Lebanon. Okay. So what's the wisdom here for us? That work that is sacred, work that is transformative, thrives under conditions of peace. Conflict between nations, between people, between a husband and a wife, in a family, whatever, conflict in a workplace, conflict drains the energy that's needed for building. So there's a difference between a building phase and a putting out fires phase, right? So the message here is that before we attempt to construct anything meaningful, a home, a community project, um, anything that's new, first goal is to work on establishing peace. Now, I did think about this, and I was thinking in times of crisis, we don't always have the benefit of that. Something has to happen. It made me think of when there's a a weather-related crisis in some other country, and Israel sends a mobile medical unit, for example. Just sounds a little bit like the Mishkan to me. Um, that it's all packed up and ready to go, and they fly with these things, and they open up tents, and they have beds, and they have medical equipment, and they set up a whole thing. Obviously, that is not the that's in a time of crisis, it's in a time of conflict and so forth. But in general, when we're starting something new, it is conducive to the success of a new project to be doing it in a peaceful setting. Okay, that's the first lesson. The second lesson is that the wisdom of Solomon is emphasized before construction begins. So there's raw intellectual power, and then there's wisdom. Intellect alone is not sufficient to achieve greatness because history is just filled with gifted people who did not use their intellect for good or who came to bad ends. So I did a little research here. So one this somebody who came to bad ends was the philosopher known as Nietzsche, who died in the year 1900. He was, I imagine you've heard of him, profoundly influential philosopher, but later in life, he had some kind of mental breakdown and he spent his last decade in life in a vegetative state. So that's somebody who comes to a bad end despite their intellect. But listen to this. This is so fascinating to me. In the Nuremberg trials in 1945, at the end of World War II, I don't know who authorized this, but they tested the IQ of 21 Nazi leaders during the Nuremberg trials. I guess they were trying to figure out what would make somebody or a bunch of somebodies behave in this kind of way. And almost all of the major defendants in the Nuremberg trial tested in the superior range. They had IQs between 120 and 143. So the point I'm trying to make is that intellect is one thing. It doesn't always lead to good ends by itself. What it needs is wisdom. Okay. So that's why I think that the Torah emphasizes not the raw IQ points that Shlomo Melech had, but the wisdom that he had. Okay. Also, another lesson is um, beauty is not vanity if it's for an elevated purpose. So the text describes these beautiful materials, cedar from Lebanon, carved palm trees, cruvim with gold overlay. Both the Mishkan and the temple were intentionally built to be physically beautiful. And across cultures, humans kind of instinctively adorn what they consider sacred because beauty signals reverence. So in Judaism, we have a concept called Hidur Mitzvah, which I think I did not put that in. It it comes from the book of Exodus, from the book of Shemot, chapter 15, verse 2. This is my God, and I will glorify him. What is the concept of Hidur Mitzvah? It encourages going beyond the minimum requirement to use aesthetically pleasing, high quality items and methods for ritual purposes. So let's take, for example, the Kiddush, the prayer over wine that Jews make on Friday night. Technically speaking, you could make it in a paper cup. Just as long you need a certain volume of wine or grape juice, but you can make the blessing holding a paper cup. But we don't do that. We have silver cups. We have beautiful decorated ceramic cups. We have um, cups with jewels, whatever your family, whatever your style is. That's an example of elevating the physical beauty of the mitzvah. Um, and so I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's a distinction between beauty that is empty of spiritual value, that is just it's just hollow, and beauty that's meant to enhance something spiritual. Okay, that's a distinction, like the distinction between intellect and wisdom that we spoke about. Okay, another bit of wisdom from here is that often the most important preparation happens out of sight. So in the Haftarah, in chapter 6, verse 7, it refers to the stones that were used to build the temple. And the verse says, no hammer or axe or iron tool was heard in the house while it was being built. So Shlomo Melech, King Solomon, had a very clear notion that he did not want iron tools, which were the technology of his time, to be used to build this house of peace, because iron tools are instruments of war. And so there's two major opinions about how do you cut stones without iron tools. Um, so one one of the opinions, probably the most mainstream one, is that the stones were cut and prepared at the quarry, not on the building site. Okay, so remember the verse says, "No hammer or axe or iron tool was heard in the house," meaning the temple, while it was being built. So they prepared the stones off-site and then schlepped them over to the building site. That's one. Kathy and I were talking this morning about another. This one does not appear in the text. It comes from the Midrash. It's mentioned in the Talmud that maybe you've heard of this, maybe you haven't. There's something called the shamir. The shamir is a worm. It was a special worm that was created. It was one of the 10 things that was created before the first, at the very, very beginning of human history, and it does not exist anymore. And the worm had this supernatural ability to cut through stone. And so there is an opinion that the stones were cut with this, like King Solomon heard, oh, now he needs to build this temple and he can't use iron tools. What's he going to use? And he heard this tradition and he went looking for these special worms called the shamir. Shamir, by the way, is all there was it a prime minister or president of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir? It's a like a known name in Israel, but the shamir worm, this is legend, midrash, oral Torah, that's what King Solomon used to prepare the stones. Anyway, the idea of this preparation happening out of sight made me think of a plant or a root vegetable or a tree that grows underground. It puts out roots underground long before anything surfaces above ground. So preparation behind the scenes is an important part of the process. Um, that's the lesson there. Okay. Another lesson is that a building does not create holiness. Behavior creates holiness. So, in the middle of all this architectural detail, God interrupts with a warning that his presence in the temple is going to be conditional on the behavior of the nation of Israel. And and the condition is if you walk in my statutes, dot, 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 then I will dwell among the children of Israel. So, an example, I guess a modern example of this would be um, it, years ago, I used to go to, when I lived in America, I used to go see Broadway shows a lot. And Broadway shows used to be the Broadway theaters are very elaborate. It's not like going to a movie at your local cinemaplex. And people used to get really dressed up. And it used to be like this fancy schmancy thing. And by the time this would be like in the 80s and the 90s, by the time I was going to Broadway, people would just go like in their jeans or whatever. It's not the building that creates the the aura, it's what happens, the way people behave in the building. There's also a lesson here that permanence is conditional, that unlike the Mishkan in the wilderness, which was built with the intention of it being portable and that you could take it down and you can carry it and you can rebuild it, the temple was built to be permanent, stone, cedar, gold, but permanence is not a guarantee. Stability is a privilege, not a right. And societies endure if the moral foundation of the society endures. So I think to add to this, I would just say the only thing that's permanent in all of our lives and all of our experience, the only thing that's permanent is God. That's the only thing um, that everything else in the world as we understand it and we experience it is by definition temporary. Okay. Also, something about leadership. True leadership builds for future generations. So the greatest projects in world history are those that are built to outlive their builders. The first temple lasted about 10 times the length of the reign of Shlomo Melech. So Shlomo Melech was king for about 40 years, and the first temple lasted a little over 400 years. Um, and so leadership is not just thinking about um, now or one lifetime, but thinking about um, who's going to be able to benefit from whatever this project is, whether it's a building project or it's a program or it's a piece of art or whatever, who's going to be able to benefit from it long after the leader who created it is no longer with us. Now here I want to go a little deep into this this concept of collaboration across the nations. So we have to look at the personality of a guy who's mentioned in this parsha, Hiram of Tyre. He is supplying cedar uh, to help build the temple and building expertise. Who was he? Who was Hiram? Hiram, maybe that's how you pronounce it. Anyway, I'm going to call him Hiram. Hiram was the king of Tyre. Tyre is in southern Lebanon. So it's close to the north, relatively close to the northern border of Israel. Okay. He already had a relationship with Shlomo Melech, King Solomon's father, David. And he had sent cedar and craftsmen to help build David's palace. And when he hears that Shlomo has become king after his father, he sends congratulations. You'll find that just before this Haftarah begins in 1 Kings chapter 5, verse 15. Okay, so Hiram, in this part of the story, he's a good guy. He's not Jewish. There's nothing, he is not part of the nation of Israel. He lives in a neighboring country, but he has cultivated a peaceful relationship with the nation of Israel in the land of Israel. The cedars of Lebanon should sound familiar to you. First of all, it's mentioned over 70 times in Hebrew scripture. It represents strength, it represents majesty, it represents prosperity. Um, the the cedars of Lebanon were particularly strong, fragrant, resistant to rot, resistant to insects, rare and prestigious. So I don't work with wood, but I know that, for example, balsa wood is not as valuable as cherry wood. Okay. So I don't know so much about in Israel, the whole thing is olive wood, as you can imagine. But this cedar was apparently top notch, top quality. Okay. And so he lives, Tyre is this coastal city in southern Lebanon. So it's on the Mediterranean border, if you can picture that, at the northern border of Israel. And Tyre, the kingdom of which Hiram was the king, controlled all the forests of Lebanon. And they also had um, like shipping expertise. So they knew how to move products from Lebanon to someplace else over the water. Israel did not have cedar forests or timber experts, but Tyre did. So Hiram now he doesn't just say, "Here, take all of the cedars of Lebanon in exchange for, I mean, to help build your temple." He got something in exchange. It says in First Kings chapter 5, verse 25, that he offered cedar in exchange for what his people needed, which was wheat and oil, which was something that Israel could provide. Interestingly enough, when you live in Israel today, there's some things that we don't have that we get from other places. So Israel is a very small country. We do not have, and some of you who live in rural areas where there's a lot of ranches and so forth, and a lot of cows and stuff, we don't have that. We don't have the ability or the land to support that. So we import a lot of meat. Chickens are usually local, but a lot of the red meat that we have comes from other places because we don't have that. Okay. So Hiram, so there's this exchange that goes on. Okay. Hiram says, I'm going to give you my best cedars of Lebanon. You give me wheat and oil because that's what my people need. Okay. um, so here we have a foreign king, and in Malachim Aleph, in First Kings chapter 5, verse 7, it says, Hiram rejoiced greatly and said, Blessed be the Lord this day. What do we have here? We have a foreign king, a non-Jewish king, acknowledging the God of Israel. He's not converting. He's recognizing the God of Israel. He's supporting the building of the temple. He's not trying to become an Israelite. So he's a model for us of respect across religious boundaries, that you can do that without trying to convert the other person or without assimilating into somebody else's world. So it's interesting to note that the temple, the first temple, which is the most sacred building in Israel in its time, required foreign materials and foreign engineering expertise. It wasn't built in isolation. And I think that's an important lesson. Now, why would Hiram invest so much? First of all, just from his perspective, here's some ideas. A strong and prosperous Israel meant that he had a stable trade partner, right? He needed wheat and oil, and he had, I guess, he had cedar, plenty of cedar. And so it was good it made good economic sense. Also, Shlomo paid generously. The nation of Israel was never so stable and peaceful and um, on top of the heap as it was in the time that Shlomo HaMelech, that King Solomon and his father, King David, were in charge. That was like the golden age of Israel. And of course, when the Messiah comes, we expect it to not only meet that, but to exceed that. But you can see plainly in the world today that Israel doesn't have that kind of respect. Among us in our community, it's different. But around the world in general, Israel doesn't have this universal acclaim, universal thing. But at this stage, Hiram wants to do what he can to keep Israel strong and prosperous. Also, Shlomo paid him generously in agricultural goods because Israel was prosperous at the time. They didn't nickel and dime him. Also, the alliances strengthened Tyre's geopolitical standing. If you look at a map of Lebanon today, I believe the city of Tyre still exists, but then it was a kingdom. Now it's just a city in Lebanon. Okay. So he not only needs agricultural goods from Israel, but he also needs friends in high places. And he had that. Also, I think that it seems clear to me that Hiram had genuine admiration for the wisdom of King David and the wisdom of King Solomon. So the temple in Jerusalem was spiritually a Jewish project, but it was built with international cooperation. So, um, just to, I think this is an important point because he's not Jewish, but he has a relationship with the nation of Israel. I just want to emphasize that he loved King David. He initiated contact with Solomon. He praised the God of Israel. He supplied cedar and skilled labor. I'm just repeating. He entered into some kind of covenantal treaty with Israel, and he received fair economic compensation. But what he does not do, he doesn't convert. He doesn't attempt to influence Israel religiously. He doesn't demand control over the temple project. He supports the temple project without appropriating anything about it for himself. From a Torah perspective, we would call him a Hasid Umot Halam, a righteous non-Jew. Okay, and that exists today, and that's probably most of you, if not all of you. From a Torah perspective, a Hasid Umot Halam is language we use now to describe somebody who, number one, recognizes the sovereignty of God. Number two, respects Israel's covenantal mission, understanding that there's something special, not exclusive, to not meaning God doesn't have any kind of agreements with other nations, but there is some specific covenantal mission of Israel, of the Jewish people, somebody who acts with justice and integrity, somebody who does not try to undermine Israel spiritually or any other way. I'm thinking now of our jihadi cousins. Okay. So Hiram's relationship with King David and King Solomon models three important principles that I think are relevant to our relationship. One is respect without assimilation. He blesses Israel's God, but he doesn't become an Israelite. Support without control. He provides materials, but he doesn't say, well, if I'm going to give you all of this cedar, then the temple will be mine. And it's mutually beneficial. It's not charity. It's a mature model of cooperating with Israel. Hiram is a model of dignified, respectful, covenant honoring partnership. So he represents a non-Jew, a non-Jewish leader who recognizes Israel's divine mission, contributes to it materially, doesn't seek theological dominance, and participates in the history of the nation, important history of the nation, without erasing boundaries. So Hiram is from Tyre. I don't know if he would call himself Lebanese. That might be like a more modern political um, boundary for the land, but he certainly knows he's not from Israel. Okay. So he's showing that you don't have to become Israel to help build holiness. You can do that in partnership with the Jewish people. Interestingly enough, in the second temple as well, non-Jews were involved in authorizing, financing, supplying materials for construction. There's two men who I want to point out. Now I'm moving on to second temple period. Okay, so this is after the book of Esther, after the destruction of the first temple, after the 70 years that the Jews lived in Babylon. And there's two men, we call them Koresh and Daryavesh. You probably know them as King Cyrus or Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great. Cyrus the Great founded the Persian Empire. He was the first king of Persia. Persia is where the Jews were exiled to after the destruction of the first temple. And he issues the original decree allowing the Jews to go back to Israel and rebuild the temple. He also returned a bunch of the temple vessels that had been taken by Nebuchadnezzar when the first temple was sacked. He authorized rebuilding in Jerusalem. He encouraged financial support. And even in the book of Isaiah, in the book of Yeshayahu, chapter 45, verse 1, Isaiah calls Koresh, Cyrus, his anointed, which is a striking use of some way to describe a non-Jewish king. The second personality is Daryavish, Darius the Great, who was the third king of Persia. And he reaffirmed Cyrus's decree. There was opposite. This is in the book of Ezra, chapter 6. They started building, and then there was a stop work order, and nothing happened for quite a long time. And then Daryavish comes along, Darius the Great comes along, and he says, "No, um, I'm going to prove that this really is okay." So the people questioned if Cyrus actually really authorized the rebuilding of the temple. And Darius ordered a search of the royal archives to try to find the document, the decree of Cyrus. And he was successful and he did find it. So it convinced all the naysayers that this project was initiated according to the will of King Cyrus. Darius also contributed royal funds to help finance construction, and he also told everybody else, "Leave the Jews alone. They're under my protection. I want them to do this." And so under his reign, the second temple was completed. There's an interesting rabbinic tradition. I don't know if you know this, that Darius, was the son of Queen Esther and Achashverosh. So you have a Jewish queen in exile, right? She's in Babylon, she's in Persia, whatever it's called at the time. She becomes the mother of the king who authorizes the rebuilding of the temple. Okay, I'm looking at the time, and also listening to my voice deteriorate over time, but I want to talk about just a couple of practical applications. Some of this is we've talked about in the universal wisdom, but I want to emphasize a few points. Number one, build during seasons of peace. Don't attempt major construction, literal or metaphorical, in the middle of chaos. Strengthen your relationship with allies. I'm not talking about like war, and I'm talking about like in a workplace situation or in a family situation, whatever. Stabilize finances. Start from a place of kindness, calmness. So it's not always possible to do that as we spoke of, but it is ideal. Um, Preparation should be quiet. So we talked again about how the stones were shaped at the quarry on a a different site than the building site. And we talked about how the most sacred work often happens before anyone sees it. So think of an artist who's working in solitude. Think of a baby in utero, where the preparation for human life, it's happening, but nobody sees what's going on. I mean, obviously we have ultrasounds now, but um, do your refining privately. You don't have to announce when something is gestating, but it's not yet ready for the world to see. The Torah happens to place great emphasis on the dignity of privacy. You may already be familiar with the concept of modesty in dress as a Torah value, but the Torah also values modesty of speech, modesty of behavior, emotional reserve, avoiding boastfulness. So all of those things are which is not to say that you can't have a big personality and that be consistent with Torah. But for example, somebody who dresses in skimpy clothes, is heavily tattooed, is a recording artist, and um, maybe uses foul language and so forth, might become very popular in um, in Western culture. That would not be something that the Torah values. Okay. So here's another, we talked about this a little bit, but I want to expand on it. The idea that the Torah was built with these amazing, beautiful materials, gold, cedar, carvings. The lesson here is that if something's important, you want to invest in quality. My father, God rest his soul, used to have a saying, buy the best you can afford. And I can't tell you how many times in my head I have thought about that when I have to make a purchase, because he was a big believer in investing in quality. But whatever you're putting into the world, investing in quality and beauty can be a sign of respect. It might be a home that you're creating or a project that you're launching. When we first moved to Israel, we had owned an apartment, smaller than the one we live in now, but we owned an apartment in a city called Male Adumim. And when we bought it, we bought it as an investment in Israel, and we didn't really do anything to it because we weren't going to live there. We were still living in America. And so there's something in construction here. I don't know if it exists in other parts of the world. It's called a builder's kitchen. It's like a bare bones, it's a couple of cabinets and a sink and like basic kitchen. What if it was an apartment I was going to move into, I probably want to upgrade the cabinets, you know, have better counters, whatever. But we just took the basic builder's kitchen because it was an investment property and someplace we were going to vacation, but it wasn't someplace we were going to live full time, right? Okay. So 9 years later, we move into this apartment and we have a little money. And I thought I want to redo the kitchen because it works, like I can cook and I had these very simple stoves and I was able to function, but it wasn't very attractive. But I also had in my head this idea not to indulge in materialism. That's a very strong lesson in Israel, where let's say shopping, for example, is a lot more limited than it is certainly in the US. And so people have things and people have nice things, but shopping is not, generally speaking, in Israel, a hobby. But I had a conversation. So I was thinking, I want to redo this kitchen. Okay, it's not so attractive, but it functions. I want to redo this kitchen. But wait, you hear the dilemma that I have? Maybe I shouldn't be spending money on this because I have a kitchen that works and blah, blah, blah. So I called a rabbi that I know and I said, this is my dilemma. And he said to me, it's actually a mitzvah to have a beautiful home in Israel. It's not an indulgence in materialism for the sake of materialism, but when people come to your home and they see that you can have a nice um, aesthetic life in a home in Israel, it encourages them and it rises the esteem of Israel in their eyes, something like that. And so we did. We went ahead and renovated, and then a year later we moved. But that's another story. Okay. Um, Another practical application. Shlomo, as we talked about it at length, he partners with Hiram to help build the Holy Temple. So what's the practical application? Number one, you don't need to do everything by yourself. Collaboration can lead to better outcomes. You collaborate with people who have things that you don't have for the success of a project. And also, it's not just collaboration, it's cross-cultural, cross-national, cross-religional. That's not a word. Cross whatever. This cooperation, it's not a betrayal of your identity to work with people who are different from you. If you maintain the clarity of your mission and you have boundaries, you can cooperate with other people. Um, so an, Another thing that builds on one of the lessons, the Shlomo's building something that he will not personally enjoy for its duration. That's called legacy leadership. Legacy thinking transforms leadership from what's good for me right now to what's good for my people, however you define that, for a longer period of time. So, in the work that I do with you guys and with people like you, I understand that what I'm doing in this role is going, God willing, to endure beyond me. I'm building something here. I'm building a platform to be or Lagoyim, a light to the nations that I think will outlast my lifetime. That's a very specific example of this. Okay. Also, the temple practical application. The temple was designed to reflect spirituality. So your environment affects your soul. And order reduces anxiety and beauty elevates consciousness. So, what's a practical lesson? Creating physical spaces that reinforce your values or reflect your values. One of the hallmarks of a Jewish home is books. I'm in a room, one, two, three, four, six, seven. I have 8 full, what you see behind me is not where I really am, but I have 8 full bookcases, and this is just one of the rooms. We also have books in the hall, and in the living room, because learning is a strong Torah value. So our environment is a reflection of that. Okay. Outer environments shape inner consciousness. The spaces that we inhabit, they also influence who we become. So think about that in your own life, how your environment supports your um, can support your spiritual goals. I don't want to say who it is because she didn't give me permission. I'm just thinking of this now. But there's somebody in our community who told me a number of years ago that she has like a prayer corner for herself. Um, that she set up. I guess it's just, I don't think it's a very big space. I really don't know. But it's a place where she goes and that puts her in this contemplative mindset where she does her prayers and so forth. And that matters. Even in a synagogue, people have what's called a makom kavua, which means your regular place. This is the seat that I sit in. This is where um, I have the physical space that helps me connect to God. And the last thing that I wanted to just emphasize as we're finishing is that the temple itself was said to be magnificent, and it was destroyed by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar 410 years after it was built. And that's the nature of the world. And I'll just leave you with this, and that is that nothing, nothing except Hashem lasts forever. Okay. There you go. That is today's lesson. Thank you for being with me. I am going to, as we have done in the past, I'm going to finish the recording and clock out and invite you to come back and we'll talk more informally among ourselves. So just go back to the original link that you logged into and I'll be there. Just give me 1 minute. Thank you for joining.